Greetings, folks, and welcome to our first little talk on Jane Eyre. What I'd like to do today is address some of the themes that we'll be discussing, certainly with this novel, and in many cases, not just in the Bronte unit as a whole, but throughout the course. I've only asked you to read to chapter 17 at this point, so I won't refer to anything beyond that point in the text, but even so, I should be able to, I think, give a reasonable introduction to the kinds of thing that I'd like you to have your eyes open for as we work through this text specifically, and as I said, also through the other texts on our syllabus. My intention for these talks, by the way, is not to simply lecture to you about the novels that we're reading. I don't think that would be a very satisfying way for any of us to approach these texts, especially at the level of a senior course. So what I'll do instead, although obviously I'll be referring to the books and to specific passages in the books, I'll try to do it in such a way as to not so much lay out what the text is doing or saying, or what I think it's doing or saying, but invite discussion and invite responses, which you can then offer either in the online space I've provided or in our Friday tutorials. I hope that works for you. If you find at some point over the term that this is not the approach that is really working for you, you can always feel free to nudge me in a different direction. We're all still sort of swimming in a relatively new environment right now. And very much, even after a term of experience in the fall, still sort of figuring out what we're actually doing. All of which is to say, if you have any criticisms or comments, I won't take them personally. As for the specifics of what I wanted to talk about today, I'd like to talk a little bit about social class and the sense of human worth that emerges in the book, because this is very much a book about human worth and on what it might be based or from what it might arise. Questions of gender are, of course, very important to the novel, as are questions of empire. And there's, I think, a really interesting comparison to be made between religious discourse on the one hand and the discourse of folklore on the other. So I think these are the things I'd like to explore, just taking a look at a few passages from the early chapters of the book, to just give a sense of how we might approach the novel. Of course, there are lots of other approaches that we could take, and hopefully some of these will come out during our conversations. For now, though, I think we should just get started. Like many Victorian novels, Jane Eyre is explicitly concerned with questions of class, wealth, and human worth. Jane, of course, when we meet her, is a dependent child, a dependent girl child, so one of the most powerless positions that actually existed in Victorian culture. She is the begrudged beneficiary of in-laws with whom she has neither blood relation nor sympathy. To the best of her knowledge, she has no living relatives, and is, moreover, constantly reminded of her state of dependency. She is, by any socio-political measure, a portrait of vulnerability, whose social identity seems, at least when we first encounter her, to be completely beyond her control. She is what other people say she is, and has solace really only in solitude and in books. Books that she is constantly reminded are not even hers. And she doesn't even have the asset of a pleasing physical appearance. She is, in other words, devoid of virtually every tangible advantage that you could think of. Her vulnerability is highlighted by the various degrees of abuse that she receives at the hands of the Reeds, both verbal and emotional abuse from Mrs. Reed and outright physical abuse from John. Maybe we should take a look at the initial scene between Jane and John and think a bit about what's happening there. It begins with Jane in her reading nook out of sight of the Reed cousins when John comes in looking for her. When he can't find her, he calls out, Where the dickens is she? Lizzie, Georgie. Joan is not here. Tell Mama she's run into the rain. Bad animal. And that comment, bad animal, which may seem like just a throwaway, is I think worth pausing on because John, of course, is a bully. He's an archetypal bully. He's older and stronger and socially more powerful than Jane, and he uses all of these advantages in order to put her down. She, of course, on the other hand, being both more perceptive and more intelligent than he is. He is, in other words, in miniature, a sort of incarnation of power or force as deployed against the weak. And part of his strategy in doing that, part of his verbal strategy in doing that, is exactly that comment, referring to her as an animal, verbally dehumanizing her. Bronte here seems to recognize that part of placing oneself above another to the point of abuse, to the point of physical violence, involves, at least discursively, removing the other from one's human community, from one's ethical or moral community. So that throwaway comment, those two simple words, bad animal, they're doing a lot of work. And this is work that we see, I think, done elsewhere in the text, or even implicitly in different ways in the scene as it unfolds. But of course, it's not just the animal part of the phrase that's doing that kind of work here, is it? That word bad is also sort of a key as to how to read the way Jane's treated, because John isn't the only person to impute badness onto her. One of the things I'd like you to have your eyes open for as you go through this book, and other ones as well, is questions of who gets to control whose identity. This book is concerned very much with the making of an identity, the construction of an identity, and questions of who decides who you are, who has that power, who has that authority, and in what does that authority rest. The scene that unfolds with John first taunting and then physically beating Jane, ostensibly punishing her for the way she'd previously spoken to his mother, Mrs. Reed. But of course, this is dishonest, isn't it? John is simply looking for an excuse to take his antipathy out on Jane. This brings up another question, or another theme, I suppose, that I'd like you to have in mind as you work your way through the book, and that is the relation between words and deeds. How do we know people? We know people through what they do, and we know people through what they say, but how are these things related? John is constructing a post hoc rationalization for something he was going to do anyway. How many other characters do that in this novel? And what characters, and why, and under which circumstances? Or to put it bluntly, how do people justify violence here? And what do you think Bronte is doing with those justifications? We initially have that question arising in a squabble between two children, but this is also something that plays out geopolitically and is playing out geopolitically as Bronte writes her novel, in the form of the expansion of the British Empire, and questions of empire are very much bound up in this exchange as well. We'll keep going with it, and you'll see what I mean. The scene continues. Accustomed to John Reed's abuse, I never had an idea of replying to it. My care was how to endure the blow, which would certainly follow the insult. What were you doing behind the curtain? He asked. I was reading. Show the book. I returned to the window and fetched in silence. You have no business to take our books. You are a dependent, Mamma says. You have no money. Your father left you none. You ought to beg, not to live here with gentlemen's children like us, and eat the same meals we do, and wear clothes at our mamma's expense. Now I'll teach you to rummage my bookshelves, for they are mine. All the house belongs to me, or will in a few years. Go and stand by the door, out of the way of the mirror and the windows." I did so, not at first aware what was his intention, but when I saw him lift and poise the book, and stand in act to hurl it, I instinctively started aside with a cry of alarm. Not soon enough, however. The volume was flung, it hit me, and I fell, striking my head against the door and cutting it. The cut bled, the pain was sharp. My terror had passed its climax, other feelings succeeded. "Wicked, cruel boy," I said. "You are like a murderer, you are like a slave driver, you are like the Roman emperors." I had read Goldsmith's History of Rome, and had formed opinions on Nero, Caligula, etc. Also, I had drawn parallels in silence, which I never thought thus to have declared aloud. "What? What?" he cried. "Did she say that to me? Did you hear her, Eliza Georgiana? Won't I tell Mamma? But first," he ran headlong at me. I felt him grasp my hair and my shoulder. He had closed with a desperate thing. I really saw in him a tyrant, a murderer. I felt a drop or two of blood from my head trickle down my neck, and was sensible of somewhat pungent suffering. These sensations, for the time, predominated over fear, and I received him in frantic sort. I don't very well know what I did with my hands, but he called me rat, rat, and bellowed out loud. Aid was near him. Eliza and Georgiana had run for Mrs. Reed, who was gone upstairs, and now came upon the scene, followed by Bessie and her maid Abbott. We were parted. I heard the words, "Dear, dear, what a fury to fly at Master John! Did ever anybody see such a picture of passion?" Then Mrs. Reed subjoined, "Take her away to the Red Room, and lock her in there." 4 hands were immediately laid upon me, and I was borne upstairs. And, well, that's a lovely little scene, isn't it? John's sense of ownership of everything that surrounds him is worth commenting on. He, of course, is not yet an adult. His mother is administering what will eventually be his estate, but his mother doesn't actually own it. The transfer of property in Victorian society tended to go from father to son and so on down the male line. Women had very few opportunities and very few rights regarding ownership, occupation, education, and what have you. John recognizes this and recognizes that his mother is not a real authority, but rather a stand-in for masculine authority. She's basically filling in for his dead father until he's old enough to take the reins. But the estate, he already knows, is not really hers. And the minute he becomes an adult, when he reaches the legal age of majority, his mother will become his dependent. So Bronte is highlighting here a real discrepancy between reality and appearance, isn't she? It looks like this is Mrs. Reed's house. Mrs. Reed behaves as if this is Mrs. Reed's house. But John knows that it's actually his house, and he doesn't even respect his mother. That is, the appearance of authority that Mrs. Reed seems to wield is just that. It's an appearance. It's not a real thing. She is basically wielding her dead husband's authority until her live son is old enough to deprive her of it. And that process is really nicely summed up by John's very quick transition from referring to our books at the beginning of his dressing down of Jane to just a few lines later referring to my bookshelves. And as long as we're on the topic of books, it is worth noting that we see 2 different uses for books in this scene, don't we? Jane is reading a book at the beginning, and yet she ends up having a book thrown at her towards the end. There's a lot in this distinction as well, because the uses of books matter, don't they? A book can be used for enrichment. It can be used for solace. It can be used for entertainment. But also, a book can be imposed on someone unwillingly. Or if you prefer, a book can be weaponized. We see this concretely with John. We see it metaphorically with Mr. Brocklehurst, whom we'll discuss in a few minutes. And we see it geopolitically in the colonial endeavor, in the unfolding and expansion of the British Empire, and its imposition of its particular political and religious ideologies on various subject peoples, a matter to which we'll return once you've read further in the book. But before we move any further along the topic of empire, I skipped over some of John's assumptions about human worth, and I think these are really important. John sees his own worth as coming from his father, not as being rooted in himself. He values himself. He thinks he is important because he is the son of an aristocratic father who left him a sizable estate. He thinks Jane ought not to eat the same food as he eats and ought to be out begging for her bread because she doesn't have those same advantages. So for John, human worth is not rooted in the person itself. It's rooted in the person's circumstances. For Jane, on the other hand, and this is something we see throughout the book, what she's pretty much always concerned with is not the circumstances, but the person who's at the heart of the circumstances. She's the exact opposite of John, and I think it's actually no accident that John and Jane are masculine and feminine forms of the same name. John, in some ways, I think, is sort of a dark or inverse double, a shadow figure for Jane. And as long as we're on the topic of shadows and doubles, there is, of course, the Roman Empire reference in there, and the reference to tyranny, the reference to the imposition of authority, the imposition of power simply by virtue of the ability to do so, that is, of tyranny, at a time, as I said, when the British Empire is in the process of doing exactly the same thing, with all kinds of nice-sounding rhetoric to make it sound like it's a worthy endeavor, which of course the Romans also had. But with the comparison of John to the Roman Empire, or implicitly the British Empire, there's a sense in which I think we can fairly say that Bronte is suggesting that that whole endeavor, that whole escapade, can be understood as little boys pushing people around because they can. And, as John does, making excuses after the fact, and particularly often excuses involved in the rhetoric of protecting their women. And wow, that last slide took about 3 times longer than I expected that it would. And it's probably time that we move beyond chapter 1. And I think one thing I might like to do, rather than just following the narrative in a straight line, is consider a couple of different overall categories of discourse that are operating in the book. On the one hand, we have Christianity, and we'll talk about that one first. And on the other hand, there's a really interesting folklore, fairy tale, ghost story kind of discourse going on as well. And I'd like to say a little bit about that. These two discourses exist in definite tension with each other, and they're both involved in questions of the construction of identity and the interpretation of the world through which Jane and other characters and the reader move. On the question of Christianity, the 4 characters I'd like to address, each of whom sort of presents that worldview in a different light, are Miss Abbott, Mr. Brocklehurst, Miss Temple, and Helen Burns. We'll start with Miss Abbott. Consider this exchange in Chapter 2 between Jane and Bessie and Miss Abbott. This is just after the encounter with John. Jane is still quite upset, and there is some talk about physically tying her down. Miss Abbott makes a move to take off her garters to that purpose, and Jane responds, "Don't take them off," I cried. "I will not stir. In guarantee whereof, I attached myself to the seat with my hands." "Mind you don't," said Bessie. And when she had ascertained that I really was subsiding, she loosened her hold of me. Then she and Miss Abbott stood with folded arms, looking darkly and doubtfully on my face, as incredulous of my sanity. "She never did so before," at last said Bessie, turning to the Abigail. "But it was always in her," was the reply. "I've told Mrs. often my opinion about the child, and Mrs. agreed with me. She's an underhand little thing. I never saw a girl of her age with so much cover." Bessie answered not, but ere long addressing me, she said, "You ought to be aware, miss, that you are under obligations to Mrs. Reed. She keeps you. If she were to turn you off, you would have to go to the poorhouse." I said nothing. I had nothing to say to these words. They were not new to me. My very first recollections of existence included hints of the same kind. This reproach of my dependent had become a vague sing-song in my ear, very painful and crushing, but only half intelligible. Miss Abbott joined in. "And you ought not to think yourself on an equality with the Mrs. Reed and Master Reed, because Mrs. kindly allows you to be brought up with them. They will have a great deal of money, and you will have none. It is your place to be humble, and to try to make yourself agreeable to them." "What we tell you is for your good," added Bessie, in no harsh voice. "You should try to be useful and pleasant. Then, perhaps, you would have a home here. But if you become passionate and rude, Mrs. will send you away, I'm sure. Besides," said Miss Abbott, "God will punish her. He might strike her dead in the midst of her tantrums, and then where would she go? Come, Bessie, we will leave her. I wouldn't have her heart for anything. Say your prayers, Miss Eyre, when you are by yourself, for if you don't repent, something bad might be permitted to come down the chimney and fetch you away." They went, shutting the door and locking it behind them. There's a lot going on in this little passage, isn't there? For starters, the notion of restraint, that there's a threat to physically tie her down because she was defending herself, basically. She knows this, they don't, because they haven't asked. And this also is a question of narrative and identity and imposition. Other people are constantly trying to overwrite Jane, to tell her what she is, that she is dependent, that she is poor, that she is a bad person. And very few people ever actually ask her about herself. They tend to talk at her and to talk about her, but very few talk with her, which means that speech about Jane in the book very often is not about understanding, but about containing and controlling. The characters who break this pattern, and of course there are all worth paying very close attention to. You'll notice them when you come to them. I'm struck as well in this scene by Miss Abbott's comment that Jane has a lot of what she calls cover. This, of course, makes psychological sense, doesn't it? A child living in an abusive situation does develop cover. You develop disguises, a facade behind which you can hide. Because, of course, if you're always under threat, the last thing you want to do is expose yourself. This is an adaptive response to a particular situation, which Miss Abbott chooses to interpret, I think, as a negative, as a character flaw on Jane's part, rather than attributing it to its actual cause, namely the abuse that Jane perpetually suffers. There may be some motivated reasoning here. Miss Abbott relies upon the Reeds for her livelihood. It's going to be very difficult for her to be objective in this case. This being said, Miss Abbott and Bessie both have different relationships with Jane. And as we see a little later on, Jane and Bessie are genuinely fond of each other in ways that no one else is fond of Jane at Gateshead, and in ways in which Jane is not fond of anyone else at Gateshead. We'll get to her in a moment. For the time being, we're still dealing with Miss Abbott. Now, her name is interesting, isn't it? An abbot is a monk who is in charge of an abbey, that is a religious official, who has authority over a particular house of devotion. Like so many names in the book, this one is not an accident. Her name itself carries churchly authority, and particularly Catholic authority. I don't want to push that too far, but it's certainly something we should have in mind, especially when, as she leaves the room, locking Jane in, she threatens her with hellfire and with being spirited away by some creature that might come down the chimney. That is, for Miss Abbott, religion is a threat. It's something she uses to control Jane, to control someone under her authority. She tells Jane she is bad and needs to repent, that she is flawed, and she blames Jane for Jane's own suffering. She doesn't blame the circumstance, as I said. She blames the recipient of the abuse for the abuse. She victim blames. That is, from Miss Abbott's point of view, Jane is unhappy because Jane is bad and Jane does not deserve to be happy. Jane must repent or Jane will go to hell. And that threat of eternal post-mortem torture that is so much a part of so many facets of Christian discourse is something we want to pay attention to. Which of the characters who embody some facet of Christianity appeal to it, and which don't? One who does, of course, is Mr. Brocklehurst, whom we meet in Chapter 4. Brocklehurst also, of course, is a really interesting name, isn't it? Brockle is a strange word. One of its meanings as an adjective, actually, is smelling of sulfur. Another word for sulfur, of course, is brimstone. So, pardon the pun, it's a hell of a name. As for his interactions with Jane, at one point during their conversation, he comments, "No sight so sad as that of a naughty child," he began, "especially a naughty little girl. Do you know where the wicked go after death?" "They go to hell," was my ready and orthodox answer. "And what is hell? Can you tell me that?" "A pit full of fire. And should you like to fall into that pit and to be burning there forever?" "No, sir." "What must you do to avoid it?" I deliberated for a moment. My answer, when it did come, was objectionable. I must keep in good health and not die. Obviously not the answer he was looking for. But again, we see the threat of eternal torture being used to control a young child, to get her to do what somebody else wants her to do, to conform to an institutional authority that clearly does not have the interest of the child as one of its priorities. Jane's answer, of course, though objectionable and impossible in the long term, is realistic, psychologically speaking. Jane's common sense here is on display. But passing over common sense, let's get back to the Bible. "Do you say your prayers night and morning?" continued my interrogator. This is a few lines later. "Yes, sir." "Do you read your Bible?" "Sometimes." "With pleasure? Are you fond of it?" "I like Revelation, and the book of Daniel, and Genesis, and Samuel, and a little bit of Exodus, and some parts of Kings and Chronicles, and Job, and Jonah." "And the Psalms? I hope you like them?" "No, sir." "No? Oh, shocking! I have a little boy younger than you who knows 6 Psalms by heart, and when you ask him which he would rather have, a gingerbread nut to eat or a verse of a psalm to learn, he says, 'Oh, the verse of a psalm. Angels sing psalms,' says he. 'I wish to be a little angel here below,' and then he gets 2 nuts in recompense for his infant piety." "Psalms are not interesting," I remarked. "That proves you have a wicked heart, and you must pray to God to change it, to give you a new and clean one, to take away your heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh." I'll stop there with that scene and say a little bit about it, then move on to nicer people. As for the little con man in training, that one's pretty obvious and barely needs to be commented on at all. Except maybe to note that this is Bronte's way of flagging, or one of Bronte's ways of flagging, that her characters are in a setting, they live in a society that rewards religious hypocrisy. As for the books of the Bible that Jane actually likes, these are actually really interesting books. A lot of them are visionary books, books that fire the imagination, books that involve visions of the end of the world, for example, or angels or what have you, or exciting stories of creation and global floods and all of those fun things. The boring stuff, of course, or what she identifies as boring, are the Psalms, largely songs of praise or regret or longing. Very moving in their own way, but you can hardly expect them to be exciting or interesting to a 10-year-old. But because Jane in this case is in many ways simply a normal child, a normal, well-read person who actually is quite well-read where the Bible is concerned by the list that she rhymes off, Brocklehurst tells her that she is broken, that she is spiritually broken, and that there's nothing she can do to fix herself. This is insidious, isn't it? You're broken. You are flawed in such a way as to merit eternal hellfire, and there's nothing you can do to fix it. You have to ask for someone else for help. Jesus fucking Christ, if you want to mess with a kid's head, I can't think of a better way of doing it than that. Turning her against her own nature as if that were a bad thing. Bear this in mind. We haven't talked about Romanticism yet. I kind of got sidetracked and did this lecture instead. But the tension between institutional authority and individual authority, between the impositions of a dominant discourse and one's own nature, are very much a part of Romanticism, and we will get to that, I think, in the next talk. We really have to. But as I said, I would like to move on and talk about some nicer people, and this slide seems to be taking a long time too. I really do hope to have this sucker posted before sunrise. In any case, I think it's time to talk about Miss Temple, the superintendent at Lowood, and in many ways I think a foil to both Miss Abbott and Mr. Brocklehurst. Her name brings her into opposition with Miss Abbott pretty clearly. They're both Miss, and their names both reflect places of worship. But where Miss Abbott is a hellfire kind of person, Miss Temple, rather than using doctrine to try to control Jane, simply lives by the values of her worldview as she understands it and uses these to nurture Jane and to nurture the children under her authority. And she, of course, is one of these people who, rather than talking at Jane or talking about Jane, actually talks with Jane. She is in a position of authority, but doesn't use her authority as power. Rather, she uses it as a means to tend to the well-being of the people under her. And in this sense, she is the exact opposite of Brocklehurst. Brocklehurst, as you all know because you've read beyond this point by now, is a transparent hypocrite. And it's in this sense that Miss Temple is a foil to Mr. Brocklehurst. Miss Temple also takes Jane on her own merits rather than accepting on authority something that was told to somebody else on authority that in itself didn't have any factual basis. These are different ways of looking at not just the world, but at religious text. Brocklehurst simply accepts the argument on authority because he trusts Mrs. Reed. And then he speaks from a position of authority and expects the people at the school to act accordingly. Miss Temple, on the other hand, judges the case on its merits rather than on what she is told. That is, she has the intellectual honesty to evaluate for herself that with which she is presented. Similarly, she doesn't tell Jane what Jane is. She actually genuinely tries to find out what Jane is. Or to put it in terms similar to what I've used before, she doesn't try to inscribe her own narrative onto Jane. She tries to find out what the narrative of Jane is. she also, in seeking a reference letter from Mr. Lloyd, appeals effectively to empirical authority, to an outside source, rather than simply accepting what she is told without challenging the assertion. As for Helen Burns, the student who dies of tuberculosis during Jane's first year, as I indicated last lecture, she is actually based on Charlotte Bronte's elder sisters, both of whom died of tuberculosis while away at school. And she as well, along with Miss Temple, is the other conspicuously, at least relatively positive embodiment of Christianity in the novel. She doesn't come without problems, and Jane recognizes the problems of Helen's particular approach to her faith. These are worth mentioning because what we actually get in the first few chapters is a fairly wide array of ways in which a person in that society might approach that particular worldview. So how does Helen approach her faith, and why does it matter? And in answering that question, probably the best place to look is towards the end of chapter 9, in Helen's last scene. "You came to bid me goodbye then. You are just in time, probably. Are you going somewhere, Helen? Are you going home?" "Yes, to my long home, my last home." "No, no, Helen," I stopped, distressed, while I tried to devour my tears. A fit of coughing seized Helen. It did not, however, wake the nurse. When it was over, she lay some minutes exhausted. Then she whispered, "Jane, your little feet are bare. Lie down and cover yourself with my quilt." I did so. She put her arm over me, and I nestled close to her. After a long silence, she resumed, still whispering, "I'm very happy, Jane, and when you hear that I am dead, you must be sure not to grieve. There is nothing to grieve about. We all must die one day, and the illness which is removing me is not painful. It is gentle and gradual. My mind is at rest. I leave no one to regret me much. I have only a father, and he is lately married, and will not miss me. By dying young, I shall escape great sufferings. I had not qualities or talents to make my way very well in the world. I should have been continually at fault." "But where are you going to, Helen? Can you see? Do you know?" "I believe, I have faith, I am going to God." "Where is God? What is God?" "My Maker and yours, who will never destroy what he created. I rely implicitly on his power. I confide wholly in his goodness. I count the hours till that eventful one arrives which shall restore me to him, reveal him to me." "Are you sure then, Helen, that there is such a place as heaven, and that our souls can get to it when we die?" "I'm sure there is a future state. I believe God is good. I can resign my immortal part to him without any misgiving. God is my Father. God is my friend. I love him. I believe he loves me." "And shall I see you again, Helen, when I die?" "You will come to the same region of happiness, be received by the same mighty universal parent. No doubt, dear Jane." Again I questioned, but this time only in thought. Where is that region? Does it exist? And I clasped my arms closer around Helen. She seemed dearer to me than ever. I felt as if I could not let her go. I lay with my face hidden on her neck. Presently she said in the sweetest tone, "How comfortable I am. That last fit of coughing has tired me a little. I feel as if I could sleep, but don't leave me, Jane. I like to have you near me. I'll stay with you, dear Helen. No one shall take me away. Are you warm, darling?" "Yes." "Good night, Jane." "Good night, Helen." And after which, of course, Helen passes away in her sleep. But how does Helen present a different perspective on Christianity than do the other characters that we've already addressed? Well, one answer to that question, of course, is that she uses her religion as a source of consolation, not as a source of power or authority. For Helen, this is an internal journey. an internal process or an internal relationship that she doesn't hold over other people, as, for example, Brocklehurst does, or as Abbott does. And interestingly for her, therefore, it's a source of peace rather than a source of authority. But here we see that she and Jane are very different in this regard, don't we? Helen is very patient, and Jane, while sometimes admiring her, also questions earlier in the book whether being as patient as Helen is a good thing, because, of course, perpetual patience precludes the possibility of improvement. So the kind of patient suffering embodied by Helen, while it is a genuine source of peace to Helen, is arguably not socially useful if your concern is a better life in this world. And that is quite clearly what Jane's concern is. Jane is not striving for happiness in some hereafter, as Helen is, and is doing with complete integrity. Jane's interest is in the world in which she lives, not the world into which she may die. And her skepticism regarding Helen's faith is, I think, notable here. She respects it, and she keeps her skepticism to herself at the end. I think that's probably an act of compassion on her part. But as much as Jane can admire, we might say, the purity of Helen's faith, she's also aware of its pragmatic or social or practical weaknesses. And on this note, I think I need to stop talking about the book's treatment of Christianity right now. I have labeled this slide Dueling Discourses, and I should probably get on to the other discourse, or the other collection of discourses, and see how they stack up. But in terms of what we might broadly call myth-based discourse, Christianity isn't the only one that's present in the book. There's also a really strong folkloric element, and this exists in definite tension with the Christian elements in the novel. Why don't we go back to chapter 2 and take a quick look at Jane taking a look at herself. This passage is just shortly after she's been locked in the room after being threatened with hellfire by Miss Abbott. My seat, to which Bessie and the bitter Miss Abbott had left me riveted, was a low ottoman near the marble chimney-piece. The bed rose before me. To my right hand there was a high, dark wardrobe with subdued, broken reflections, varying the gloss of its panels. To my left were the muffled windows. A great looking-glass between them repeated the vacant majesty of the bed and room. I was not quite sure whether they had locked the door, and when I dared move, I got up and I went to see. Alas, yes, no jail was ever more secure. Returning, I had to cross before the looking-glass. My fascinated glance involuntarily explored the depth it revealed. All looked colder and darker in that visionary hollow than in reality, and the strange little figure there gazing at me, with a white face and arms specking the gloom, and glittering eyes of fear moving where all else was still, had the effect of a real spirit. I thought it was like one of the tiny phantoms, half fairy, half imp, Bessie's evening stories represented, as coming out of lone ferny dells and moors, and appearing before the eyes of belated travelers. I returned to my stool. I bring this up for a few reasons. One is the clear juxtaposition between Miss Abbott's Christianity and Bessie's folk tales. And these are two very different types of discourse, and they carry different weight or authority within the culture. Christianity, of course, is the religion of the culture. It's an authoritative, I wouldn't say the authoritative, but definitely an authoritative discourse within both the novel and the English reading public of the time. It is a discourse associated with books, and one book in particular, so it ties us into the discourse of books themselves and the authority contained therein, whereas Bessie's tales are oral tales. They're tales passed down by word of mouth, told mostly by women to children at night, for example, whereas biblical discourse is basically a masculine discourse. It was made up by men, propagated by men, and any honest reading of it has to arrive at the conclusion that it propagates a patriarchal authority. It is, moreover, a totalizing discourse, a discourse that argues, asserts, claims, demands that other perspectives be considered wrong, that other world views are necessarily not only wrong, but evil and perhaps even diabolic. This, of course, is a discourse very well suited to the establishment of empires, which themselves are also definitionally totalizing structures or totalizing endeavors. But also within Britain, Christianity is historically a foreign worldview. This is something that came from outside. The folktales, on the other hand, carry very little authority outside of, for example, the nursery. They're gendered feminine, as I said, rather than being gendered masculine as the Bible is. But they are indigenous. They are an organic part of the culture and an organic part of the people in a way that Christianity really is not. This is something that both Charlotte and Emily are working with in their respective novels. So we'll be addressing this a fair bit with Jane Eyre, but it'll come up again in a big way in Wuthering Heights. The figure that Jane sees in the mirror is arguably her true self. That's kind of the way I'm inclined to see it, but that may just be my reading. It's a figure that she sees as part fairy, part imp. That is, she has her own way of interpreting herself that is not the official discourse of her culture, but the discourse that she has organically shared with the one person who has actually taken the trouble to raise her with some kind of affection, and a person associated with the organic and very, very deeply rooted culture of her place. Or to put it another way, the discourse of the nursery, the discourse of the folk tales, of the stories passed down by word of mouth from time immemorial in that particular place, are specifically the discourse that the more official or more respectable discourse of the dominant religion is trying to overwrite. But this is the discourse that Jane uses to see herself, to understand herself. This is a truer reflection and a truer articulation of what she is, what she sees when she looks at herself. This is not something imposed upon her, not something inscribed upon her. This is Jane. But of course, this is also Jane locked in a room where her uncle died that is believed to be haunted. And a few pages later, there is at least the possibility in a conversation between Bessie and Sarah that there's been a ghost sighted on the premises. That is, the Gothic is also very present here and pressing up against the dominant discourse that is trying to overwrite it. And with these little hints in mind, I think I'd like to skip ahead to Thornfield, where the folktale elements are more emphatically present. And for our purposes right now, there are two elements I'd like to address there. One is the folktale creature, the Gitrash, that is sort of conjured up in Jane's imagination when she first hears Rochester approaching in the twilight. This is in chapter 12, and Jane has just left Thornfield to go mail a letter. The din was on the causeway. A horse was coming. The windings of the lane yet hid it, but it approached. I was just leaving the stile, yet as the path was narrow, I sat still to let it go by. In those days I was young, and all sorts of fancies bright and dark tenanted my mind. The memories of nursery stories were there amongst other rubbish, and when they recurred, maturing youth added to them a vigor and vividness beyond what childhood could give. As the horse approached, and as I watched for it to appear through the dusk, I remembered certain of Bessie's tales, wherein figured a north of England spirit called a gitrash, which, in the form of a horse, mule, or large dog, haunted solitary ways, and sometimes came upon belated travelers, as this horse was now coming upon me. It was very near, but not yet in sight, when, in addition to the tramp, I heard a rush under the hedge, and close down by the hazel stems glided a great dog, whose black and white color made him a distinct object against the trees. It was exactly one mask of Bessie's gitrash, a lion-like creature with long hair and a huge head. It passed me, however, quietly enough, not staying to look at me with strange pretercanine eyes in my face, as I half expected it would. The horse followed, a tall steed, and on its back a rider. A man, the human being, broke the spell at once. Nothing ever rode the gitrash. It was always alone, and goblins, to my notions, though they might tenant the dumb carcasses of beasts, could scarcely covet shelter in the commonplace human form. No gitrash was this, only a traveler taking the short-cut to Millcote. And this, of course, is our introduction to Rochester. So we first encounter him through the lens of Jane's recollections of the folklore of her youth. And there's much about his presence that does sort of resonate with that figure of the gitrash. Granted, he's riding his horse, and she says that writes it off automatically, but still, his dog fits the bill, and his horse is impressive. These two elements are both elements of that composite or shifting figure, which incidentally seems to have a fair bit in common with another related figure, a trickster nature spirit that goes by the name of a puck, which also has equine associations that are reflected really kind of humorously through the pranks of Shakespeare's Puck in A Midsummer Night's Dream. But that's a digression. What's important at the moment is to note that the discourse through which Rochester is introduced is the discourse of folklore, the discourse of the indigenous English storytelling tradition. So there's a sense, perhaps, that Rochester at least has a hint of that depth of association with the place where he is. And as the place where he is a grand old stone manor to which he has the aristocratic title, this also brings us potentially into the realm of the Gothic, which of course is already more than just a little bit present through the sounds that we've heard before of the laughter in the attic. The other folktale element that I wanted to bring out is a little less obvious. That is the thorn trees that give Thornfield its name, which are first described for us in chapter 11. And here what I'm thinking of is the story of Sleeping Beauty, who of course is, depending on the story you read, pricked by a needle or a thorn. And in the oldest version that I'm aware of, in the Icelandic Volsunga saga, she is actually a Valkyrie who's been pricked by one of Odin's sleep thorns. But this was a fairly widespread story at the time in various versions, as I said. And it's not just that there are thorns, but rather if we take a look in chapter 12, after the encounter with Rochester, when Jane returns to Thornfield, she says, "I did not like re-entering Thornfield. To pass its threshold was to return to stagnation, to cross the silent hall, to ascend the darksome staircase, to seek my own lonely little room, and then to meet tranquil Mrs. Fairfax, and spend the long winter evening with her, and her only. was to quell wholly the faint excitement wakened by my walk. There's a sense that Thornfield is asleep. It's a place of sleep, of stagnation, as Jane says. And if we see Jane as a sleeping beauty figure, then of course, I think the implication is that she's kind of always been sleeping in a way, because there are erotic undertones to the Sleeping Beauty tale in most of its manifestations. And the waking up of the sleeping maiden is an erotic gesture. It suggests that there's a thawing in her, an arousal of an erotic nature that had previously gone unacknowledged. And this as well goes right back to the oldest surviving version of the story. And it's in Thornfield that Jane's erotic nature is first awoken. I'm going to stop talking about that now because I think this theme is actually developed pretty well over the course of the novel, and I want you to discover bits and pieces of it as you're moving through. So I think that's about what I want to say. And I suppose that's it for now. I hope you found this interesting and useful, and I look forward to talking to you on Friday.